Get him!
So, have you made the trip back to Midgar yet and played the Final Fantasy VII Remake demo before the launch of the full game? Well, we have, and we've also played a little bit beyond the Sector 1 reactor bombing mission and gotten to grips with all 4 of the playable characters in the first part of the remake. Square has recently confirmed that sadly, Red 13 will fight alongside your party, but he won't be controllable by the player. If you've been struggling with the new combat system or are just keen to pick up some tips, don't worry, we've got you covered.
Don't overdo it.
The main thing to bear in mind with the Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat is that it's a lot more strategic than it looks. It may often seem flashy and frenetic, but treat this like a hack and slash and you will lose fast. A lot of Final Fantasy fans, myself included, were disappointed with how unengaging the combat was in Final Fantasy XV. It felt like you could just run around the battlefield and hammer away on the basic attack button without really thinking about what you were doing. And you'd eventually win anyway. At first glance, FF7 Remake's combat looks similar, so it's completely understandable that players would think it works in the same way. But seriously, if all you're doing here is holding down the basic attack button, you are not going to get far. Button mashing is only going to get you killed, and so it feels kind of deliberate that the very first boss fight in the game can be a challenging one. But even before that, it helps to think of the Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat as essentially the same as the original, but where in the original you'd sit and watch the ATB gauge fill up before you could select a character's next attack, the remake simply gives you something to do while that bar fills up, which will help it max out faster. Basic attacks from any character do minimal damage on their own. They're really just a way of filling your ATB gauge to allow you to do more meaningful attacks. This is where the game combines real-time action and menu-based commands to create a kind of hybrid system that respects the design of the original game that fans fell in love with, while bringing everything in line with combat systems modern players have become accustomed to. The result is something that works incredibly well, even if it does take a little bit of getting used to find its rhythm. When you initiate a fight, your ATB gauge starts at 0, so you most likely always begin with some basic strikes. You can switch between your party members if you have them too, either issuing commands or controlling them directly. The aim is to launch a sustained assault in order to put an enemy into pressured status, which appears beneath their name when they've received a decent chunk of damage or have been hit with certain attacks. When an enemy is pressured, that's the time to hit it with as many spells and abilities that it's vulnerable to as you can, in order to stagger them as quickly as possible. A staggered enemy is completely defenseless for a short amount of time, and takes 160% damage, so it frees up your party to just completely wail on them and bring the fight to a close. That all sounds straightforward, but the skill is in making sure you're maximizing the effectiveness of each party member and ensuring they always have something to do. Luckily, out of the 4 playable characters confirmed for the remake, each has a defined area of expertise that calls back to their general role in the original game, while adding to their arsenal of abilities and refining their skills a little bit. Clyde, as the leader and the heavy hitter of the group, is the first character for you to get to grips with. Just like in the original, he favours raw power over magic use, and he's all about hitting hard and piling on the pressure while staying up close and personal with enemies. His special move is the ability to switch between his default operator mode into an ultra-offensive Punisher mode, where he'll take far more damage, but deal considerably more too. You can't use abilities or magic or dodge while in Punisher mode, doing so will just switch you back into operator stance. But blocking melee attacks will be automatically followed up by a powerful counter. Although he's very much a close-range fighter, Clyde's abilities that he unlocks later in the game will mean he can throw some attacks from afar. And it's just as well, since the fact that you now move the party around the battlefield surely means long-range materia is no longer a thing.
Deal with that.
It's my time to shine.
At any rate, long range is very much Barrett's domain, as you'd probably expect of anyone with a Gatling gun for an arm. His basic attacks don't do loads of standalone damage, but every little helps and they do add up over time if you're holding down square for a constant barrage of bullets. Not only that, but it's often up to him to stagger airborne or far away enemies to put them within reach of the melee fighters. His special move, Overcharge, has a long cooldown but deals significant damage and greatly boosts his ATB gauge, so it's a great opener to any fight. Barrett also starts the game with lightning materia equipped, so you're going to want to keep him busy casting thunder as much as possible, as he'll often be the key to staggering those early foes. Be aware that he actually moves slower than other party members while in combat, so it's best to keep him out of range of attacks that require quick evasion or dodging. This also makes him much better placed for magic use than, say, Clyde. Barrett's abilities maintain focus on long range a bit later in the game too, but they also expand his role to something of a sentinel, where he can jump in and take damage intended for other, squishier characters.
I'm counting on you.
Tifa is very much still a brawler, and her high movement speed means she can run rings around the others, dealing an onslaught of kicks and punches that look cool as hell. Her abilities are all about attacks that either boost her ATB gauge, pile the pressure on enemies for easier staggers, or boost the power of her next attack, meaning it's all about angling for those long combos and strings of attacks that will quickly bring enemies to their knees. She's a lot of fun when put on crowd control duty, her Star Shower and dive kick moves looking particularly awesome. Later in the game, we can imagine her role expanding to include inflicting plenty of negative status effects on the enemy too. And even though we tried to play Tifa as much as humanly possible in a recent demo, this kind of made clear that part of the strategy for the Final Fantasy VII Remake is knowing when each party member is needed and where exactly their particular moves can make the biggest difference in a fight. Not that that'll stop us in any way, shape or form from using Tifa wherever and whenever we can, to be quite honest with you.
I've got this.
Here it comes!
At our recent demo, we also got to play briefly as Aerith during the Abzu boss fight in the sewers alongside Clyde and Tifa. It'll come as a surprise to absolutely no one familiar with the original game that Aerith is, first and foremost, a healer. As such, it feels like she's actually better controlled remotely through issuing her the odd command, rather than guiding her directly. In this boss fight anyway. Lose the healer, lose the party, and sometimes it can be too tempting to get just that little bit too close to the action. Although she does have some offensive abilities, including summoning a magical butterfly familiar, it feels like making the best use of Aerith is about knowing not to rely on her for damage dealing, but to switch to her or issue her healing commands where necessary. Of course, that may change later in the game when you get to load her up on materia and make use of her natural magical skill and huge MP bar. The genuinely impressive thing about the FF7 Remake is that every enemy feels like a mini puzzle to solve. Just like in the original game, the mechanical enemies are incredibly weak to thunder spells, but there are other, newer holes in enemy defenses that you need to figure out for yourself. One of the trickiest sort of standard enemies in the free demo, the Shock Trooper, is hyper aggressive. If you just throw basic attacks at them, they will continue to dodge and swipe at you. But if you take a step back, switching to Cloud's Punisher mode, which as we've mentioned can automatically counter melee attacks while blocking, you'll stun them for long enough to get some powerful attacks in while taking minimal damage yourself. This really is the ideal approach for most enemies you meet. With similar looking games, you usually feel the need to rush in, go all out offensive and finish off enemies as quickly as possible, but the FF7 Remake rewards far more considered, careful combat. Every boss and enemy has a weak point, a combination of abilities or elemental weaknesses that will give you a far more satisfying kill than simply holding down the square button and hoping for the best. We've fought 3 bosses in the game so far: the Scorpion Sentinel, Airbuster and Abzu, and all 3 genuinely required a unique approach and represented a real challenge until we actually started thinking critically about what we were doing. We really can't wait to see how other battles in the game hold up. or how the remake will reinvent other party members in future installments.
Coming at you, hard fast.
Okay, that was pretty cool. Alright, come on.
You can check out one of our other Final Fantasy VII Remake videos on the channel by clicking on one on screen right now. And do subscribe to Eurogamer for more gaming content. Right, we're off to practice our somersaults some more. Bye!